Okay, today, not much of a surprise here, as you can tell by the screen. We're going to be taking a look at the poem Ex-Basketball Player, and that poem is written by John Updike. So, as per usual, I'll run through the analysis of the poem with you, read the poem, and then we'll try to figure out some things that certainly could be going on with it. But before reading the poem, as always, we're going to take a look at the title here, Ex-Basketball Player. And I think there's not a whole lot of room to the imagination when it comes to what this poem would be about. Although one thing to really kind of focus on and at least be aware of, and it seems fairly obvious, but I think to still be aware of is this prefix on the word basketball, ex-basketball player. So, well, we got a pretty good idea that the poem is probably going to be about an ex-basketball player. One of the things that we would want to make a prediction about is, why is this person an ex-basketball player? And so there's a couple different, ideas here that we could be taking a look at. That it's simply, an old ex-basketball player, someone who is retired, someone who just simply doesn't play anymore. Could be the idea that this is a person who is injured, or something along those lines. So there certainly still are some possibilities that could be out there. While we know we're dealing with an ex-basketball player, we don't know the reason for that player no longer being active. So we're going to run through reading the poem here by John Updike, and then we'll take a look at the analysis of it. So certainly you want to follow along on your copy of the poem. So, Ex-Basketball Player by John Updike. Pearl Avenue runs past the high school lot, bends with the trolley tracks, stops, cut off, before it has a chance to go 2 blocks at Colonel McComsky's Plaza. Burst Garage is on the corner facing west, and there, most days, you'll find Flick Webb, who helps Berth out. Flick stands tall among the idiot pumps, 5 on a side, the old bubblehead style, the rubber elbows hanging loose and low, one's nostrils are 2 S's, and his eyes an E and an O, and one is squat, without a head at all, more of a football type. Once, Flick played for the high school team, the Wizards. He was good, in fact, the best. In '46, he bucketed 390 points, a county record still. The ball loved Flick. I saw him rack up 38 or 40 in one home game. His hands were like wild birds. He never learned a trade. He just sells gas, checks oil, and changes flats. Once in a while, as a gag, he dribbles an inner tube, but most of us remember anyway. His hands are fine and nervous on the lug wrench. Makes no difference to the lug wrench, though. Off work, he hangs around May's lunch and net. Grease gray and kind of coiled, he plays pinball, smokes those thin cigars, nurses lemon phosphates. Flick seldom says a word to May, just nods beyond her face toward a bright, applauding tiers of Necco wafers, nibs, and juju beads. All right, while I was reading the poem, I highlighted a couple things, one being what we have here in the last stanza, and then also in the second stanza, I highlighted the part where it comes to the idiot pumps. And the reason for that is this poem, is written, meant to kind of remember from the 1940s and 1950s, makes reference to Flick setting the county record in 1946. So when it talks about the idiot pumps, it's literally talking about gasoline pumps. And you can see the part where, it mentions about the E and the S and the O is going to be right here at the head of the pump, where it does have a little bit, of a human shape to it, a little bit of human body, where you got the round head, you have the elbow here that it talks about kind of hanging low, and this part here being the body. So the pumps are all for Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the main gas station, the main supplier of gasoline at the time. But what happened is over time, everything kind of starts to get nicknames or shortened. So it was called Standard Oil, and kind of just like we have British Petroleum, which is BP, Standard Oil became known as SO. But what happened is then the phonetic spelling of it started to be used in the shorthand. So rather than the letters SO, it was spelled out as an SO. And so that's where you would have pumps from the 40s, 50s, and 60s that you'll see have SO on it. Literally just means Standard Oil. The other part then in the last stanza makes reference to nibs, Necco wafers, and juju beads. These are all types of candy that were certainly very popular in the 1940s, 1950s, and still are around today. Nibs pretty much end up becoming Twizzlers, ends up buying Nibs eventually. So when it makes reference to the applauding tiers of Nibs, Jujubes, and Necco wafers, This literally would just be stacks, cartons of candy that would be behind the counter that would be for sale. Also within that paragraph there, or excuse me, within that stanza, there's the reference here that would be made to lemon phosphates. That's just going to be like a soda, carbonated beverage, so similar to like a Sprite, Sierra Mist, something along those lines. All right. Okay, so that's our reading of the poem. Now we're going to kind of take a look at, paraphrase. What's going on in each one of these stanzas is going to now be the focal point here that we're going to be taking a look at. So, you know, the poem as a whole is one of 5 stanzas, and each stanza contains 6 lines. And we know the focus of the poem is the life of Flick Webb. So when it kind of comes to this question that we had up here, who is our ex-basketball player? At least what happened. Well, now we know who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the character of Flick Webb. All right, but our poem describes this life of Flick Webb. Once as a high school basketball star, but now his glorious past, several years behind him, is just a gas station attendant whose life appears to have reached a dead end. The first stanza begins with brief geographical detail of Flick's hometown, a town never named in the poem, but presumably somewhere fairly small and rural, possibly like Updike's hometown here in Pennsylvania, meant to be one that people can certainly relate to regardless of where they're from. The reader learns that Flick spends his days helping out at Berth's Garage, which is located on the west-facing corner of Colonel McComsky's Plaza. Couple things to kind of take note of. Notice that we did mention that, all right, here we're getting a little bit of biographical information, and you certainly have what would appear to be a bit of a metaphor that is happening here. Pearl Avenue runs past the high school lot, bends with the trolley tracks, and stops, cut off before it has a chance to go 2 blocks. And what you have here so far as a metaphor, as symbolism, even would be that the road, Pearl Avenue, is much like the life of Flick Webb. It runs past the high school during his glory days, but then what happens once it gets past the high school, it is cut off. It just kind of ends. And much like Flick's time as a star, as a basketball player, once he gets past high school, there's nothing to happen. What does he become? He's someone who's simply working at Berth's Garage. He's just doing a regular, everyday job as anyone else. His exploits as a high school basketball player haven't really helped him out at all. A little subtle thing to take note of is on the corner facing west is where you will find Flick Webb. Notice that he is facing west. And if you think about things so far as like the sunrise and whatnot, where does the sun rise? It rises in the east, and ultimately it sets in the west. So this is really kind of more of what we would associate as the end of something. When it's kind of like in its twilight, the sun is going down, it's coming towards the later part of the day. So this is very much kind of like a sunset or the twilight of Flick's life. So the description here that we have ends up being very symbolic of who Flick Webb is as a person and a basketball player. The second stanza, we end up getting a snapshot of Flick at Berth's Garage standing tall among the idiot pumps. And by him standing tall among the idiot pumps, certainly, it's kind of playing into his success as being a basketball player. The bubblehead style of gas pump, old-fashioned even at the time when the poem was written in 1954, features a glass globe on the top, as we showed earlier. In the earlier decades of the 20th century, gasoline was often sold at stations that might sell more than one brand, so the brand identified by the globe was going to be Standard Oil or SO, so you could have multiple types of gas to choose from. One of the pumps at Berth's Garage dispenses Standard Oil, SO brand gasoline, and the narrator of the poem sees it and the other pumps as athletes, the hoses, rubber elbows hanging loose and low, like a basketball player. Another squat pump with no head is more of a football type. So it's at Berth's Garage, where you have a lot of the ex-athletes, seems like in town, they would be the ones who are working there. So the gas station is where all of the ex-athletes tend to work. So work at Berth's Garage. I'll just leave that as a G. Couple of the things to take note of. Certainly, we have a metaphor taking place where we are describing the rubber elbows hanging loose and low. This is going to be a metaphor that the pumps, and the athletes are kind of going together. So you're getting the different shapes. You certainly have a lot of imagery that is also taking place on this side, so far as bubblehead style, standing tall among the idiot pumps and whatnot. So within this second paragraph, we continue to have emphasis placed on metaphor, as well as imagery. In stanzas 3 and 4, the narrator's camera lens begins to widen, and the reader begins to learn more about Flick's past and story. The narrator reveals the fact that Flick was a fine high school basketball player, having scored 390 points in 1946, which is still a county record. The narrator also in the third stanza refers to himself directly for the first time in the poem, noting that he had once seen Flick score 38 or 40 points in a game. So there is a little bit of shift here where it goes from third person to first person. So the detail implies that Flick and the narrator probably ended up attending the same high school. However, as the reader learns in the fourth stanza, Flick's successes were all in the past, as he never learned a trade and just sells gas, and checking oil, changing flat tires. Once in a while, he dribbles an inner tube for amusement of friends, but most of whom would not need the reminder of Flick's past and what he's done, because people certainly remember him. You take a look at what's going on. Also, when it comes to some of the figurative language that's getting used, at the end of the third stanza, his hands were like wild birds. Certainly, this is going to be an example of a simile, so being used to describe what his hands were like. They were fast, they were quick. He could probably dribble a ball better than anyone else. Changes oil, checks oil, changes flats, dribbles an inner tube. Certainly get some things here dealing so far is imagery, kind of setting a picture, sensory in the reader's minds. So there's a lot of imagery that would be happening here. When we get into overall, with that TPCASTT, as we're kind of talking about the connotation, there certainly, I would say, would be two shifts that we'll be paying close attention to. One of them already mentioned here with I saw him rack up. So we have here a shift that is occurring, and literally this is just going with like the overall narration style, where it goes from third person and then does a shift to first person. The other shift is going to be happening here at the fifth stanza, the last one. If Flick has seemed until this point in the poem a slightly comic figure, cheerfully dribbling his inner tubes, he begins to appear more pathetic and even perhaps sinister in the fifth stanza. The picture of him here, grease-grayed and kind of coiled, imagery again, playing pinball, smoking cigars, and drinking lemon phosphates, as I said, a kind of soft drink at May's Luncheonette, where he hangs out when he is off work, is disturbing, as is the fact that he seldom speaks to May, but rather nods beyond her face toward bright applauding tiers of Necca wafers, nibs, and juju beads. The audience that loved him in high school, where he was scoring points for the basketball team, has moved forward, yet still wanting the applause, Flick turns towards junk food and candy for sale at that small town diner for the emotional substance that he still craves. So, as noted here, we have a shift more in the way that Flick is being presented, where he goes from kind of being a comic character to one that, as noted, could be a little bit more sinister, could be a little bit more pathetic. I'm going to go for the sense of to more of a tragic character, that he is someone who never was able to move beyond the glories of high school, for the main reason that a trade, as gets mentioned earlier on in the poem, is never ever actually learned. So we have a variety of connotation that would be taking place. Certainly, as we mentioned, I would be taking a look for connotation, the idea of symbolism, metaphor, simile, and certainly we also highlighted the fact that there is a lot of imagery that is going on within the poem as well. Overall attitude, certainly there are some thoughts of nostalgia taking place, looking back. But I think if you were going to try to identify the attitude as a whole, rather than it being something that is celebrating the past of what Flick was able to do, and cherishing those nostalgic, remembering moments and revering him, I would say that the attitude is one where it's a little bit more foreboding. I think it is meant the poem to kind of serve as a warning, or if we were going to pick a tone word, probably a little bit more ominous, in the sense that this could happen to anyone. So Flick's downfall is not something that is only specific to Flick. And I think the fact that we have an unnamed town kind of adds towards this, but this is something that could happen to anyone, where that glory could be happening at a young time and then it could be taken away. When we talk about this metaphor here at the top of the poem, with that first stanza where Pearl Avenue runs past the high school lot before it bends with the trolley tracks and stops, cut off. Notice how Updike does put emphasis on the fact that it is cut off. It just stops. It never gets that opportunity to really kind of go anywhere. And so by having cut off at the end of the line, it certainly helps to kind of emphasize that point, that his life, his success story is like literally just cut. It stops right at that moment. And now he's just going to be at Brisk Garage at Colonel McComsky's Plaza. So we've talked about Shift. Now coming back to our title revisited. Everything that we've pretty much been doing for the most part at this point has been an interactive poem, or excuse me, has been a naming poem. If we take a look at now our TPCASTT, it's been an interactive poem. If we take a look at this poem, this one is certainly going to be more of a naming poem, where literally it is about an ex-basketball player. What we have learned about this poem is, though, it's an ex-basketball player who never really learned another trade, and so what he is solely going to be identified as is an ex-basketball player. Flick has never had any other kind of talent, never other kind of trade, nothing else to be identified by. So Flick is only known as an ex-basketball player. Overall theme is not simply going to be that make sure that you have something other beyond sports to focus at, but certainly the idea that it's important in life to have some kind of purpose, beyond what you did at a younger age. So, this could certainly happen to anyone. You could go with, certainly, since we're in that kind of school setting, the idea that education is important. He's never learned a trade. As we get here in the fourth paragraph, he never found something beyond the temporary. So it's important to have, purpose in life. It's important to have something in life that is going to be able to sustain you beyond the short term, whether it's high school, college, or even before then. So from a thematic standpoint, I'll let you kind of write that how you would want, but I would kind of take note of, life beyond high school. I would certainly take a look at the importance of a purpose. And as I said, that could be education based. That certainly could also be employment based. And also the idea how this is meant to be a relatable poem that could be happening in any part of the country, any age group, or any, if not age group, any generation. This isn't something that would only pertain to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, things of that nature. All right. So I hope you enjoyed the poem "Ex-Basketball Player." This will be should be the last TPCast that we're going to do for our poems at this point, as we've pretty much gone through all the others. So you'll submit this as normal. Again, make sure with that paraphrase you do go into detail for every single stanza, identify your line numbers, the types of figurative language that you're looking at, and the examples of them on that TPCASTT paper that you have. All right. Hope everyone's doing well, and we'll talk to you later. Again, this was Ex-Basketball Player. Have a good one.